Now, the South African Music Rights Organisation remains steadfast in its commitment to advocating for the rights of music creators. The organisation has successfully distributed over 33 million rand in royalties to its members on digital platforms for the 2024 financial year. Additional to that, SAMRO has another distribution scheduled from June this year. Karabo Senna, who's the organisation's General Manager for Sales and Licensing, joins us for this milestone and more. Thank you very much for your time, Karabo. Give us a sense of what exactly this accomplishment means for music, for musicians and others in the value chain that are putting out their work on digital platforms.
Thanks for the invite. So I think what this means essentially for musicians is that, you know, every single time somebody creates music nowadays, the main distribution platform is now digital, right? Not so many people are on the physical side of music. So that means, you know, organizations such as SAMRO and those that create music are much more reliant on royalties that are generated from these digital avenues. So our positioning of this particular drive to make sure that we increase revenue that is linked to then payment of royalties is focusing on what we would call your DSPs. These are the iTunes and Spotify's of this world, as well as, you know, your YouTubes, TikToks and Instagrams of this world, which we call, you know, UGC, which are user-generated content sites. And then lastly as well, we have, you know, your VOD, so your video on-demand services such as Netflix, because all of these services use, you know, artist music every single day. And sometimes when we think of music, it's not just commercial music that we license. So it's also production music. So mood music, when somebody's watching a movie, those sounds that you hear, somebody created them. So our focus in terms of highlighting this massive payment in distributions is to say that we are actually on the right path, making sure that those that distribute music digitally are able to be paid through royalties.
Yeah, and give us a sense of how that actually works, Karabo, the quantifying of how much a musician would get for the music that is played or used in any of the platforms that you've just described to us.
So essentially, we would have different licenses with different providers. The way it works in the music business is that organizations such as SAMRO would license, let's say, for example, in the South African territory, and then thereafter there would be, you know, a license that speaks to a percentage of revenue that is obviously based on whatever that particular DSP or VOD service would be able to make. Based on that, we then receive what we call usage. So any music that is used in that particular service is then shared with us, and we monitor it to make sure that we are in essence receiving the right usage, or let's say the right tracks, as you would say it. And then from there on, our focus is to make sure that what we have then licensed as a percentage of revenue is then paid over. So the trick of the game is that obviously if your music is played the most, then you would most likely earn the most. That's how royalties function. So it's not necessarily one could say, here's the specific figure, but at the end of the day, we like to see our South African users enjoying music, and from that, we know that we are able then to have royalties of this nature. You know, right now it's 33 million, but as you said, there's the last one coming through in June. So we are aiming to actually exceed this 33 million towards 40 million rands, and that's just for digital. Not talking about radio or TV or any other type of distribution that SAMRO has.
Yeah, what about the challenges, Karabo, that are still posed by the unregistered music creators who rather have unnotified musical works? How is that issue being dealt with when it comes to these royalties?
So we have systems in place that most creators would know of, but the ones that don't know, the easiest thing that we often say is that please get in touch with us. So, but the systems dictate that, you know, SAMRO would anytime your music is used, even though you're not a member of SAMRO, we would park the money, put it in suspense. And that would mean that the person has a given time, at this point is about 3 years in which they are able to come through and inform us that, listen, I'm Karabo and I wrote certain songs, and then we would obviously track it on our system based on what we've put in suspense, and based on that we're able to pay it out. But the challenge is the following: if the person does not necessarily register or follow, and it doesn't have to be with SAMRO, it could be with another CMO in another country even, that means then on the 4th year, whatever it is that was due to them, it is distributed in relation to market share to the other creators. So it is vital that if you're a creative, you essentially make sure that you are a member of SAMRO, because then we are able to ensure that not just if your music is used in South Africa, but your digital content can also be used in Germany, in the US, in France. We have bilaterals or relationships with those respective countries to make sure that the money can come through to SA, and then we paid over to the musicians. So at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that you monetize every single stream of income that you can monetize, and musicians are not only focusing on live performances.
So are there any plans, Karabo, for musical veterans who operate in the rural areas still, who perhaps distributed their work on cassettes and vinyls? You did speak about the fact that this doesn't include television, radio and other distribution avenues, but is that taken into account, or is that something that's taken care of in general?
Yeah, so we do work side by side with other partners in the industry. For example, SAMRO's focus is obviously the licensing and collection of these particular licenses and paying out royalties. But we have, organizations such as that we call distributors, right? Distributors would essentially be the people that complete the function that you just mentioned. And from that perspective, they're able to aggregate all these different songs and offer them to the services. So SAMRO doesn't necessarily do that part of the business. Our focus is purely licensing. And from the licensing segment, we then represent musicians by making sure that they are then receiving their respective royalties. But it is important that, I think with the internet, I would encourage, even if you are much older, ask, a young person that, obviously a grandchild, one of your kids, to say, please just help me so that I'm able to publish my music, online, because there are tons of South African music that's not even online. And, that is a great resource where people could be making money or monetizing these things that we call music. To us, we see them as assets. They could be monetizing that, but now they are not. And that's a great tragedy.
No, it is a great tragedy indeed. And then a final thought from you, Karabo, and if we could just veer off the royalties that we've been chatting about, the ongoing grooming allegations in the music industry in light of what we're seeing in the United States playing out with P. Diddy. Are you concerned as an industry about what we're seeing coming out of one of the biggest players in the music industry? Everybody grows up wanting to go and make and create music in the US, but with concerns of this nature, the authenticity of that music making process now comes into question.
Sure. And I think, from a SAMRO position, we, about 2 years ago, we took an interest specifically, firstly in South Africa, more focused on females, because we looked at it from a positioning of saying, what is the state in South Africa? And we found that females in the music industry essentially go through a much, much tougher or much more intense process compared to their male counterparts. And purely because of the way the industry is built. And remembering that majority of the eventing as well happens at night and so forth. So it's a space for the most part that's not really conducive to females. And then after we looked at data internally, where we found that as little as 20% of females actually earn what one could consider as reasonable compared to 80% of their male counterparts from a royalty perspective. So we started, with a specific research, and we have launched multiple programs meant to now try and empower females. And with that, obviously, there are other gaps in the industry similar to the one that you see in the States. And we are obviously, looking at it, trying to see how we can help this particular industry to maneuver around it. Because obviously, as much as, we are in South Africa, but sometimes what you may see happening outside of our borders may also have an impact here. And we always try to posture ourselves so that we can move prior to something becoming systematic. And what we have seen now, what we can obviously prove through research, is that from a female perspective, at the least in South Africa, it's much, much harder for you to be a musician. So we want to offer as much support, but we are keeping our eye very close to obviously what's happening in the world. And with that, it will indicate how we move forward as well within SAMRO.
And of course, the different stakeholders that you work with. Karabo, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That is Karabo Senna from the Southern African Music Rights Organization, touching on that important milestone around royalties being paid out to musicians who have their work on different social media platforms. And then, of course, touching on another important and worrying issue around grooming in the industry, but also the challenges, as you heard him say, that women in particular face, and how the organizations like his own are trying to change the tide. Continuing with matters around music, we move over to Grammy winner